Good morning, and thank you very much for the opportunity to join you at this conference addressing the future of refugee management in the Great Lakes region. I'm very happy to be part of this discussion and to have the opportunity to speak with you this morning about human trafficking in the context of the Great Lakes region, and also the links with conflict settings and refugee protection. As I'm sure all of you, trafficking is a global billion-dollar industry. It has been described by the International Labour Organization as one of the fastest growing transnational criminal activities of the 21st century. And trafficking for all purposes of exploitation remains prevalent across the Great Lakes region, including for the purpose of sexual exploitation, child sacrifice, exploitation in begging, child marriage, labour exploitation, and forced criminality. We have seen significant developments in the region, including this year the adoption of the second National Action Plan on Trafficking in Persons in Uganda, and the launch of the National Referral Guidelines for Management of Victims of Trafficking. This year is also the 20th anniversary of the Palermo Protocol on Trafficking in Persons, and other important human rights developments such as the UN CEDAW draft general recommendation on trafficking in persons are pending, and we hope that general recommendation will be adopted by the end of this year. That will be an important supplement to the Palermo Protocol, which in my report to the General Assembly in October, I highlighted remains primarily focused on criminal justice response, one that doesn't adequately address the human rights of victims or survivors of trafficking, and doesn't adequately address obligations of prevention and protection. The Trafficking in Persons Protocol does include, as one of its core purposes, the full respect for the human rights of victims of trafficking, but we know that at domestic level in many states, anti-trafficking legislation and policy remains focused on criminal justice and migration control. As a result, identification procedures for victims of trafficking are often closely tied to law enforcement procedures, border controls, policing, and assistance to victims is too often conditional on cooperation in criminal proceedings. This also hinders early identification of victims of trafficking, which as a result means that all of the further measures of access to protection, to effective remedies, and potentially cooperation in criminal proceedings also don't happen because we're not identifying victims of trafficking, or we are not identifying them early enough to ensure effective protection. In the context of migration, what we've seen is an increasing tendency to restriction on migration and criminalization of irregular migration. In my first thematic report to the Human Rights Council, which will be in 2021, I will be focusing on the non-punishment principle, which is a core principle of human trafficking law and seeks to ensure that victims of trafficking are not punished for crimes that they were compelled to commit. Unfortunately, however, as we know in practice, it is often the victims of trafficking and not the traffickers that are being punished. And this also undermines the goal of accountability and combating impunity, because we are punishing and prosecuting the wrong people, victims and survivors, rather than the perpetrators of the crime. And in my first report to the Human Rights Council, I want to look broadly at the question of non-punishment. So to include questions relating to detention as a punishment, for example, for irregular migration, but missing the obligation to identify among those in the context of migration who may be victims of trafficking. Looking at punishments for engagement in prostitution, whether it's administrative sanctions or criminal sanctions. looking at removals and forced returns, again, as a punishment or response to irregular migration, but not taking into account the possible context of trafficking. And I also want to look at the emerging trend of deprivation of citizenship or citizenship stripping as a punishment, in particular linked to alleged involvement with terrorist activities or activities linked to violent extremism. What I'm hoping also throughout my mandate is to really try to strengthen and support the work of prevention activities. So to move beyond the criminal law model and to address the wider dimension of human trafficking, and a particular concern in the Great Lakes region, which is host to very high numbers of refugees, people who are forcibly displaced also internally. There is a heightened risk of labour exploitation, and this is in the context of labour externalisation programmes, where we see a migration route to the Gulf region, to the Middle East, but limited oversight of the recruitment processes, of the contracts of employment, of the decent work standards that are in place, and also the follow-up to ensure effective remedies when people are returned or escape situations of exploitation. There is also the concern around what kind of assistance is being given on return. Is it ensuring long-term access to social protection? Is there a focus on preventing the cycle of trafficking and re-trafficking? According to the Uganda Association of External Recruitment Agencies, there are currently 140,000 Ugandans working in the Middle East. So this is a significant problem and challenge to ensure that labour migration can happen safely without risks of exploitation, either in the context of labour exploitation, or we know often what happens is that there is a link also to sexual exploitation. We know that the Great Lakes region is also a region of destination in relation to victims of trafficking, in the context of agricultural labour, commercial sexual exploitation, also linked to mining and extractive industries. So much more work needs to be done to ensure that states are meeting their obligations of due diligence of prevention of trafficking, and to ensure that this is happening with the support of donor agencies and governments and international organizations. The COVID-19 pandemic has the potential to exacerbate the trend of rampant exploitation as a consequence